So tonight we're going to talk about the innovative provincial, the perils of prophetic leadership, and as a little short understanding, after Vatican II, Theresa and the Sisters of Mercy of the Union experienced immense changes in their ministries and lifestyle because Theresa would not desist from speaking her sister's truth about the full equality and moral agency of women. The Vatican tried to remove her from office, but she persisted with a deep and persevering faith. So before we get started tonight, I just have to say congratulations to Chris Shank and Theresa. This week, we learned that this very masterful work earned the first place in the biography category for the 2020 Excellence in Publishing Awards from the Association of Catholic Publishers. So everybody give her a big congratulations on that. It's not surprising. I knew it was going to happen, but it's so great. It's so great. But the Association of Catholic Publishers actually noted that the total number of submissions had reached an all-time high this year. So the first place is really, really, really first place. And those people that won the first place are automatically entered into a special round of judging for the Resource of the Year, which will be announced in late June. So we're going to see this book maybe even get another award next month. So it's so exciting and so well-deserved. And I'm just so thrilled. Thank you so much. And I'm so glad it won. I'm so happy. Yeah, it's great. So this book has already received kudos from many well-respected feminists. I read you a bit of Mary Hunt's praise last week. This week, I just want to read what our fabled Elizabeth Johnson wrote. She said about the book, to speak the truth in love is an astonishing story of one woman's moral leadership in collaboration with communities of her dedicated sisters. The church and world are still in desperate need of such courageous speaking, born of deep faith and great kindness. Sparks fly out from this book to inspire a new generation. I couldn't agree more. So let me just go over a few of the rules as we gather. Just to be very clear, we are recording this conference, including the Q&A. So this is for others who can't join. So if you don't want to be on this, seen on this in any way, shape, or form, or you don't want to be noticed, we ask you to reserve your question. Maybe you could put it into the chat box when we open the chat box up at the Q&A. Otherwise, and we'll try to get to it. Otherwise, we just want to make sure that you understand that this is going to be on a video for people to see it afterwards. So please keep that in mind as you join. You want to turn your camera off or whatever you need to do, go for it. But we want to just make sure that that's clear. We are recording this. I'm going to monitor it the whole time so we stay on time. So we're going to have a great 90 minutes. We're going to allow greetings during the chat as on the chat as we get started, but we're going to turn it off during the presentation because honestly, we don't want people talking to each other while the presentation going on. You wouldn't do that in an audience. We're not going to let it happen on a Zoom call. So we want to totally give all of our attention to the presenters. They certainly deserve our attention. And then we're going to turn it back on during the Q&A. So just to let you know about that. And when we get to the Q&A after the presentation, I'm going to share some instructions about how to ask a question. It's going to be a little bit, you unmute yourself and there's a lineup and then I call on you, but we'll talk about that later. During the Q&A, we just ask that you keep your questions short to the point, that it's not really a time so much, you could say congratulations and all that, but it's really for questions. This is to be a dialogue and an exploration, a discussion, and so please keep your questions short and to the point. If you have other comments or questions, send them to me at debrose@Future Church, and we will send them on and to see what Chris and Theresa might be able to answer in session 3. So let's begin with a prayer. This prayer is very much in line with what Elizabeth Johnson says, that this book sparks uh, inspiration for the next generation. And this prayer comes from a work that we had done, that a number of Catholic Reform organizations did together a few years ago, called A Church for Our Daughters. And I think the prayer and this work and what we're examining is very apropos for a church that we want for ourselves, but especially a church we want for the next generations, you know, our daughters, our sons, those folks who will be leading in the future. So let's take a breath. In every generation, women have and continue to faithfully and generously respond to the call to serve God and God's holy people. They have been apostles and disciples, leaders, preachers, educators, counselors, musicians, artists, writers, comforters, pastoral ministers, chaplains, and yes, priestly people offering their gifts to the body of Christ. Yet our church now suffers a poverty of spirit brought about by the exclusion of women from full participation in the life, ministry, and leadership of the church. Today, we, women and men, sisters and brothers, grandmothers and grandfathers, aunts and uncles, mothers and fathers, godparents, members of the body of Christ, we gather together as one family to pray for a church that is truly inclusive and alive with the gifts, spirit, and potential of all its members. We gather in thanksgiving for and celebration of the women who came before us, our foremothers in faith, who are too often forgotten, their stories and the way they have instructed and inspired us. We gather in solidarity with the women of today whose demands for justice and inclusion call us to conversion. We gather in hope for our daughters, for our sons, for the next generation whose God-given possibility and potential compels us to work for a church for our daughters. Amen.
Amen. Very beautiful.
So last week, Chris and Theresa gave us a very good understanding of the events of 1979 when Theresa offered Pope John Paul some advice. So tonight we're going to go further into that as we look into this next phase of her prophetic leadership. And with that, I'm just going to turn it right over to Chris and Theresa and let them get started.
Okay, thank you, Deb. It's great to be with everyone. Last week we did an in-depth deep dive into Theresa's prophetic call, asking for women to be included in all the ministries of the church. This week we're going to go a sort of a deep dive into what happens if women are not included in all the ministries of the church. And we're going to look at it through the lens of a very prophetic community, the Sisters of Mercy, whose 1977 chapter set some directions that really was making an attempt to include a lens of women with the ministries that they were called to, and the women they were called to serve. So there's a lot of data here, so I'm going to dive right in. But we have to start with how the sort of the decision-making structures that happened. And I just want to highlight the fact that before the Second Vatican Council, of all the groups in the Catholic Church, perhaps none had internalized the monarchical governance, unilateral decision-making, and a military notion of obedience more than the communities of women religious. So there's no surprise then that the implicit teaching of the Vatican Council on how to exercise authority yielded very dramatic changes in the decision-making structures of the Sisters of Mercy, and I would say of most communities of women religious in the United States. I just want to quote briefly from a wonderful book that if you haven't read it, you should. What Happened at Vatican II is the name of the book by John O'Malley, S.J. It's very readable, it's small, but it really gives you the Cliff's Note flavor of what happened. And O'Malley contends that in many ways, the medium was the message at Vatican II, which did not, quote, define teaching as much as teach it on almost every page in the way the council conducted itself. So in this way that the council evolved, O'Malley says, it issued an implicit call for a change in style, and as a change in style of governance, moving from one to one that would be less autocratic and more collaborative, a style willing to seek out and listen to different viewpoints, a style eager to find common ground, and less unilateral in decision-making. And one could say that Pope Francis has some of those same values and is working for synodality. So between the 1977 chapter, which elected Theresa as Administrator General, from 1966, when Theresa was appointed to the Provincial Council, to 1977, there were huge changes in Mercy governance and lifestyle. When Theresa was first appointed, the Superior General of all 9 provinces of the Sisters of Mercy appointed all the provincial leadership, the counselors, the secretary, and treasurer. So it was a very sort of top-down model. It wasn't quite as top-down as it seems because she took advice from all the different provinces and she had a council that helped her make the decision. But that was the model when Theresa was first appointed, and it moved from that model to a bottom-up model where the chapter leadership, the provincials in each province, and the councils were elected by community members at large. And that happened in a course of 10 years. And so during this time, between 1966 and 1977, the Sisters of Mercy introduced new governance structures that greatly expanded opportunities for all sisters to participate in, and here's the key point, and therefore own the decisions that would affect them directly. And so a lot of time went into searching for a renewed communal identity and mission in light of the Second Vatican Council's call to respond to the signs of the times and also their own founder, Catherine Macaulay, her charism. And so just in a nutshell about what happened within the community and many other communities of women religious in those 10 years, Mercy identity no longer depended on a common style of dress, a certain kind of habit, a common daily schedule, or any given work responsibilities. Instead, the sisters were encouraged to, quote, recognize ministry as a religious presence in the church and not a contractual arrangement that only partially occupies times and energy and responsibility to others. So in some ways, people, saw themselves as teachers at the parish high school, and once that was done, that was it. But the new changes really sought a change in identity about what women religious were to be about. The result was that there was a growing sense of responsibility within many sisters who now were feeling ownership for their whole community, and no longer would elected leaders be the only ones responsible, which was a heavy burden previously. It also led to a really much more effective discernment model for how we make decisions about who we are and where we're going in the future. It didn't happen easily. In many ways, it was agonizing. There were many sisters who had a very difficult time with it, but it led for very rich fruit, I think, in the prophetic dimensions of what sisters are called to be that are still active today. So within the Sisters of Mercy, just a brief thing about Theresa's timeline. In 1966, she was appointed Secretary of the New York Province. In 1969, she was a delegate to the 1969 chapter, which was, again, one of those pivotal chapters where sisters could choose what they wore and were consulted about ministry. In 1970, by an overwhelming majority, she was elected provincial in New York. And again, it was sort of just an experimental year because everybody's experimenting with government models during this time. In 1971, she was reelected for a term of 3 years. And by that time, a 21-member provincial assembly was elected by the whole community, which in New York numbered 350 sisters at that time. And then that assembly elected from themselves who would be the provincial and 4 sisters. So you see that the changes in how governance happened. During this time, Theresa made a trip to Rome with the Mother General of all 9 provinces, Mother Regina Cunningham, and learned a lot by watching how she dealt with Vatican officials, because Mother Regina was regularly updating the Congregation for Religious about the changes that sisters were making in ministry, lifestyle, whether sisters were allowed to choose whether to wear a habit or not. The habit was never outlawed. It was the decision-making about it was given to the sisters. And the Vatican wasn't happy about hardly any of these things. So Theresa says she learned a lot just watching how Regina negotiated the situation. So now let's go to the 1977 chapter, which again, these government things have finally in place. And now we have more participative decision-making and discernment about directions. And one of the main things about the 1977 chapter had to do with, quote, complex questions about the nature of authority in the church. And one difficulty named at the chapter was that authority and power were perceived as being solely in the hands of the hierarchy, which left the Sisters of Mercy in the role of transmitters, not shapers of church teaching. And as a result, sisters seldom, if ever, and these are quotes from the documents themselves, corporately questioned church teaching or took responsibility for assisting in the church's search for truth. And so the position paper specifically cited areas of the moral realm in which the sisters had a responsibility, they felt, to participate in the evolution of church teaching. And what gave rise to this were several experiences within Mercy Health Ministries in which, quote, the practice of good medicine and church regulations had come into conflict. And what we see, for example, and I'm just going to name a couple of examples, because again, you have the Sisters of Mercy trying to live the church teaching in a very difficult situation sometimes. And here's one. The Board of Trustees at Chicago's Mercy Hospital passed a resolution saying, quote, it was a bad practice of medicine to close a woman after a cesarean section, to close the incision, before performing a tubal ligation if it were necessary. The hospital was concerned the woman and the hospital doctors were at risk if they had to open her up again to perform the procedure. In Chicago, the provincial was also concerned about teen pregnancies. We couldn't give teen mothers Planned Parenthood information, but had to send them to another hospital, she said. So these are the concrete issues that came up with the 1977 chapter that sort of formed a basis for the development of a special document called Our Relationship with the Church. Now, of course, the other thing that came up was a statement about women's ordination, which we talked about last week, but that was also very central to this very important chapter. And all of these concrete issues pointed to the need to evolve a document that names some of the principles at work here. And so one of the things that the document says is, as Sisters of Mercy, we can neither escape the anguish of experiencing concerns about our patients and in our ministry and the responsibility of addressing them. And they named 3 courses of concrete action. 1, an important aspect of our current ministry is to support the church in development of new teachings or new emphases within the traditional teachings to evolving moral context in church and society. 2, in some areas, we have a special responsibility to help change church teaching and practice where that teaching and practice have become obsolete, inhibitive of Christian life, or injurious to individuals. And the third element was, in extreme circumstances, this statement said, the community and or individuals within the community may find it a matter of conscience not only to work actively for change in specific church teaching, but at the same time to dissent from church teaching. And then they made this document criteria for corporate public dissent, and which is, you can all find that in the book if you're interested. But after an extended discussion, our relationship with the church document passed by an overwhelming majority, okay? So this was really pretty earth-shattering compared to where things were 10 years before, where you just said, yes, ma'am, or yes, sir. And now we have a whole community owning their moral authority in a context of faith within the institutional church. Also at the 10th General Chapter, they had elections for leadership. Theresa had been invited to run, but had declined after receiving several, because she felt she didn't receive enough nominations, because the general administrator was going to come from all 9 provinces, and the nominations came from all 9 provinces. And it was sort of an unusual thing now for sisters to be interacting across provinces. So many sisters didn't know each other very well. And as a result, Theresa got what she thought were not enough nominations to do it. Plus, she thought she wanted to continue as provincial in New York. But when she got to the chapter, so many people came to her and asked her to run for administrator general. And so she did a whole process about that to try to determine it. Actually, the person on the nominating committee who asked her to put her name in told her that she had actually gotten more nominations than just about anybody, even though it seemed like a small number to her. So after a sort of a photo finish runoff, Theresa was elected general administrator with the Sisters of Mercy in 1977. They call her, she was a dark horse because she had not put anything in the, provincial or in the union scope, the community's newsletter or anything. So I want to name the other 4 women who were elected to leadership with her, because in all of the adventures of the next 8 years, this was definitely a team effort, as Theresa would be the first to say. So I want to acknowledge these courageous women along with Theresa. And so the 4 other sisters elected with her were Sister Doris Gedemiller, Betty Barrett, Mary Ann Dillon, and Julianne Carey. So that after she was elected on Holy Thursday evening, she washed the feet of 12 sisters in what a previously planned chapter ritual, acknowledging her new role as a servant leader. So just to give you some flavor of the kind of revolutionary change that was happening in terms of understanding of leadership. Theresa remembers it feeling both peaceful and humbled by the ritual, and I'll just give a quick quote. She says, I just felt open to whatever God wanted for me at that point. I had not planned it, I hadn't set it up, and I just ended up thinking this was God's plan for me. So that was pretty big. One of the first things the new administration team did was to establish a Church Institute committee to implement this prophetic Our Relationship with the Church document that was naming all these areas that we need to enter dialogue about changing church teaching, whatever. So that was going on. And then in August 1978, Theresa was elected to the vice presidency of LCWR. She had been very active in LCWR in the New York province and was known to many. So that was one of the sources of how she came to be known to be a leader in that regard. And at the time of her election, she shared a thoughtful reflection about the nature of prophecy and power in light of the 1971 Synod of Bishops document, Justice in the World. Here's what she said, quote, a primary responsibility of leadership is to effect social change, to bring about a transformation within ourselves and within the world. But, she said, if change is to happen, sister leaders must not be afraid to use their own God-given power on behalf of justice within both church and society. And especially, she said, we must continue to dialogue very honestly with the church about not continuing to exclude women. So again, this is, and of course, just months later, she's greeting the Pope with a shrine in her presidency year in 1979. Again, in March 1980, Theresa was overwhelmingly reelected to a 4-year term as Administrator General, receiving 56 of 68 votes on the first ballot. Now, this is significant because the sisters had already begun doing a study on tubal ligation in the Mercy hospitals. They had done their statement on women, and Theresa had given her greeting at the shrine that led to a huge media outpouring as well as pushback. So the reason I'm highlighting her overwhelming election is to show that her community was solidly behind her, recognizing that she was implementing the decisions that they had made in 1977. Also, other members of the administrative team were elected. Betty Barrett ran again and was elected, and the other three I want to name are Emily George, Mary Ellen Quinn, and Rosemary Ronk. And these 5 women really stood in the breach. They bore the burden of the day's heat when it came to advocating on behalf of a pastoral approach to tubal ligations and women in political office working on behalf of just laws for poor people. In any case, in accepting her reelection, Theresa again says, we talked about leadership and prophecy at the chapter and whether they are compatible. And she says, it is my conviction that prophecy is indeed an essential part of leadership. She promises, I will commit to these 4 years a spirit of compassion, but a spirit that is critical, a spirit of strength and gentleness, a spirit of reverence and radicality. I will continue to speak the truth as I see it, as I believe it in my heart. So now we're launching into the next 4 years, and I want to just backpedal a little bit with the Church Institute Committee, because one of the first things it did, well, it issued 4 statements altogether over the course of the 8-year reign, but one of the first ones was this tubal ligation in hospitals sponsored by the Sisters of Mercy of the Union that was published in January 1980, a study of the pastoral implications of the National Conference of Catholic Bishops' ethical directives on the sterilization for women. So what's the backstop is that when the Church Institute Committee began its work, the Sisters of Mercy were delivering health services in 57 dioceses in 31 states with more than 28,000 hospital beds. They were pretty major players in the Catholic health care scene in the United States. As they began their study, this tubal ligation study had 2 parts. One was to review the teachings of the institutional church and interpretations offered by a broad spectrum of moral theologians. And I should say the people on the Church Institute Committee were moral theologians, like Margaret Farley. And so it was a very well-educated bunch of people. Anyway, at the time that they began, there was, of the 67 hospitals in the Union Mercy system, 65, the second part, I'm sorry, I should back up. The second part, they wanted to do a practical study of the Mercy hospitals to give factual information of how the official teachings of the church were implemented within a pastoral framework. And so it wasn't just that they wanted to do the theoretic, they wanted to see how this was playing out. At that time, there were 65 of the 67 Mercy hospitals in 24 states agreed to participate. And when all the data was analyzed and put together, it found that 40 hospitals did not perform tubal ligations, and 12 of these didn't even have OBGYN services, but 25 hospitals did. And so, and usually these, even though it was a small number, just 5 even had more than 20 procedures a year, but they provided limited access to tubal ligation when a pathological medical condition or other serious obstetrical conditions such as hypertension or pregnancy, diabetes. I'm a midwife, so this is why I get into this. I hope I'm not boring you to death. But anyway, it's a very important issue for women. So of the 25 hospitals that were performing medically indicated tubal ligations, they were all doing it with either the tacit or explicit approval of the local bishop. And they weren't the only ones. An additional 41 Catholic hospitals across the country permitted medical sterilization. Now, after seriously weighing the pros and cons of all of this, the administrative team wrote a tentative position statement in May of 1979. And this is what they said. We believe that tubal ligation in certain circumstances is an appropriate procedure and a necessary component of holistic healthcare, and failure to provide this service in these circumstances may cause harm to persons. In these cases, they said, a mercy hospital should provide this procedure. Since our investigation shows that church teaching in this area is not uniformly interpreted or applied, and that tubal ligation is not an available option at all mercy hospitals, the team says, we desire to draw concerned persons into dialogue about the necessity of doctrinal development of the issue and appropriate modification of hospital policies. Now, all of these hospitals that had participated in the study needed to know the feedback, and so this went out to all of those folks. So someone leaked the document very quickly, and their pushback began almost immediately. Some of the backstory for this is in 1973, the US, this is 6 years earlier, the US bishops themselves had noticed that there was a diversity of practice, had punted the issue to Rome. In 1975, Rome came back and said, oh no, never any tubal ligation, which led to a significant outcry from moral theologians such as Richard McCormick, Bernard Herring, and even bishops in Ontario. Bishop Carter concluded that significant theological support existed to allow direct sterilization in specific conditions. But anyway, so the Mercies were trying to work, the leadership was trying to work with the leadership of the US Conference of Catholic Bishops. They set up a dialogue committee. They initially refused to talk. Their idea of the purpose of the meetings was to bring these sisters back in line according to what the church teaching is supposed to be. And the Mercy's idea is, we got to talk about this because this isn't working, So that's my sort of thumbnail version. So I want to talk just briefly about one meeting. Bishop Malone, I think, was chair of the Bishops' Conference at the time. And he stated at the outset of this December 15th, 1981 meeting, that it had been convened not to mediate a position of dissent, which is how he saw the Sisters of Mercy, but restated his concern that, it's not their, basically he's trying to tell them it's not their responsibility to change church practice. But Sister Helen Marie Burns countered by saying, while the bishops had stated their purpose, the sisters have not resonated with it, she said, which I thought was very diplomatic. And Sister Margaret Farley, who's a moral theologian, observed that the nub of the problem was that the bishops and the Sisters of Mercy had, quote, fundamentally different experiences of moral obligation regarding sterilization, and that further, Roman Catholic tradition, particularly its natural law tradition, views doctrine as resting on reality and not, quote, simply pronouncements of authority. So you can see this is a pretty intense meeting. But perhaps the most dramatic moment arose when the discussion turned to the actual medical situation of a woman with a severe heart condition. Margaret Farley vividly recalls the conversation. Here's a woman who has, she explains to the bishops now, here's a woman who has 10 children. Because of her heart condition, she will almost certainly die if she has another pregnancy. Bishop Malone, after we had talked about it for a bit, said, well, of course she would be able to have a tubal ligation. But immediately, the moral theologian from the US Bishops' Conference, Father Connery, said, sorry, Bishop Malone, she could not have had that no matter what, even if she would die, okay? So, you can see what the situation is here. It's really tough. Farley grimly concluded, and that's about where we are to this day. And it is, sadly. Sister Narita Coney summed up the discussion. She says, we have the directives and the bishop's affirmation of them. We also have a number of Catholic hospitals which could be considered as not in compliance with them. Moreover, we have a number of bishops who tolerate noncompliance and some who do not. The Sisters of Mercy have done a study on tubal ligation that has raised questions for the bishops. Now, mind you, what was playing out, though, in the media and elsewhere is this is all those nasty sisters' fault. And where are the 25 bishops that are allowing this? Well, they're sort of missing in action. Again, you're getting my thumbnail opinion. The bishops did continue, to their credit, you have to hand it to them. They did hang in there. They were still trying to do the dialogue to convince the Mercies to go, but it got totally short-circuited by Rome. It issued a very definite statement that the Sisters of Mercy had to toe the line or else. And there's a lot of back and forth. They finally had something that they thought everybody could agree on with the Sisters' conscience, with the moral theologians, with the canon lawyers. And we thought we were all cool. And then over, I think, 5 or 6 months later, the statement came back, no, it's not good. You have to say never under any circumstances can you ever. And this is from Rome. The bishops' directives themselves made room for, well, if she's got cancer of the fallopian tube, she can have the surgery, you know. So it was really a messy process. In the end, the Mercy administrative team had to go along with it, much to their dismay. There was some talk of dissent, but they realized that they would only be removed from office and a more traditional, what do I want to say? It would be worse off because they had the whole community to consider. So I would just want to quote Rosemary Ronk, because each of them wrote a reflection, which if you read the book, you will be interested. Rosemary Ronk said, when we came to the final decision to send the directive as written by the Vatican, I agreed because there was no alternative for reasonable people. But ever the upbeat, stalwart, spirited woman, she says, I have experienced a loss of innocence about the Vatican that is so profound that I am sure my efforts for church renewal will soar to new heights of creativity. So you can see, nevertheless, they're persisting here. The second piece that I want to address is the whole issue around political ministry. The 1977 chapter had a vigorous commitment to systemic change on behalf of those made poor, especially poor women and children. And several Sisters of Mercy sought political office as a way to live the mercy charism. Elizabeth Moranci was elected to the state legislature of Rhode Island. Sister Arlene Violet was a candidate for Attorney General in Rhode Island in 1982. And in May, Sister Agnes Mary Mansour in Detroit wanted to run for state representative. And after carefully considering canon law, all of this was canonically okay at this time, though John Paul II did not like it at all. And he successfully had Robert Drinan leave his political office after conservative Republicans, including William Buckley, Patrick Buchanan, and William Bennett, put pressure on him to get him to remove. Anyway, that's another story. But Agnes Mary did not win her position, but the newly elected Democratic Governor James Blanchard asked her to consider heading the Michigan's largest state agency, the Department of Social Services. And he appointed her to head the department. But before that, at the time, Medicaid was covering pregnancy terminations, abortions for low-income pregnant women. It was legal at that time. And so given the complexity of this decision, Agnes Mary had a lengthy telephone meeting with Archbishop Jacques, who initially approved her appointment. In Agnes Mary's account, he told her to make clear her own stand opposing abortion and to say relative to the Medicaid payments for abortion, she was upholding the law and not to further comment on the matter, which Agnes Mary did. On December 31st, Jacques was also quoted by the Detroit Free Press supporting the appointment. A lot is being made of the fact that end quote, that the Department of Social Services uses Medicaid funds to pay for abortion, he said. It's creating a problem where there is none. As a sister, Sister Mansour must be in accord with her church, but in her job, she has to follow the laws of the state, even if she doesn't agree with them. And then he said, you know, the fact that her appointment encompasses so many of the areas women religious have traditionally worked in, the poor, foster children, it could give a powerful witness. Unfortunately, Archbishop Jacques did not stick by his earlier, support, or, certainly not intend to oppose it or withhold it. He reversed himself weeks later after a drumbeat from Right to Life people and an ad in the Wall Street Journal calling both him and Agnes Mary Mansour baby killers. Now, at this point, it's probably a good idea to note that both of Agnes Mary's predecessors were Catholic and men, and no one ever raised any issues with their exercise of leadership in that position. So this whole thing led to a very long struggle with Rome who wanted Theresa really wanted Helen Marie Burns, who was Agnes Mary's provincial, but also Theresa as the administrator general, to remove her from office, Agnes Mary from office, which they would not do. They even tried to find a way so that she could be on a leave of absence while she was doing this. But unfortunately, then Bishop Anthony Bevilacqua was instructed to require Agnes Mary Mansour, by virtue of her vow of obedience, to resign as director. Agnes Mary felt she could not do that. She had done this under good faith. And so basically the Vatican overrode the decisions of her legitimate superiors. From a canonical point of view, it was highly irregular. Father James Corridon does a very in-depth thing of that in this wonderful book, Authority and Conflict in the Catholic Church. And so it was just horrible, and to this day, Theresa, all due respect, she will tear up when she talks about it. It's not funny. It was horrible. And it was so wrenching because she was highly beloved in the Detroit community. And she went on to do wonderful work in the state of Michigan. And I just want to name a few things. The error rate, for example, under her leadership in awarding Medicaid funds, food stamps, and aid to families and dependent children dropped to its lowest level ever. She started programs addressing teen pregnancy, teen mothers, and helping victims of domestic violence. Her department had the highest national record of tracking down deadbeat parents to collect child support. Two initiatives she was really proud of was to broaden the conversation around abortion by bringing the question of family planning and alternatives to abortion into the conversation. So in every welfare office, sorry, it was fresh in here. So these were the kinds of things that John Paul II did not understand as appropriate expressions of the mercy charism. And I say John Paul II because he was directly involved in this decision. They tried to appeal it later. It went to the Apostolic Signatura. It was denied because the Signatura, which is the highest Supreme Court, said no, it had come directly from the Pope. Even 3 years later, in 1983, when the new Code of Canon Law made arrangements for people who had left communities but wanted to come back in, they set out all the procedures. Mercy leadership got a letter from Rome saying this applied to everybody but Agnes Mary Mansour. So it was a very ugly kind of thing. I want to just quote briefly from Monica Hellwig, because it's a tough issue. I don't support abortion. I think it's a moral evil. I don't support making it illegal either. I mean, I'm going to be out there with that, because as a nurse midwife, there's more harm than good that will come from it. But more to the point is we all work in systems that have tragic flaws. And what was being asked was just leave that system to its own self. Don't even try to be in there and influence for good. And this is what Monica Hellwig wrote about it. She's a wonderful theologian. And she says, redemption is restoration of all things in Christ. To participate in the restoration is necessarily to participate in ambivalent situations, in structures that are not morally and spiritually perfect. If there are structures of sin, she says, there are also structures of grace. And those structures that move toward the overcoming of cultural, racial, and political barriers that challenge and overcome oppression and greed, that redress the power of balance and resources in favor of the poor and excluded. To participate in such structures is to cooperate in grace. To participate in such structures as Agnes Mary did. So I think that's a very good principle, especially now as we're going into the next election. Okay, so all of this, these, what do we want to say, controversial issues, we're trying to bring the perspective of women serving women into church decision-making about policies that are damaging to women if we're not in the conversation. All of this leads to a crescendo of threats of removing Theresa herself from office, from US bishops, and from Rome. In early 1981, the news was circulating that the Vatican meant to take action if nothing was done about the tubal ligation study, even going so far as to remove Theresa from office. Bishop Tom Kelly, who Theresa knew well, the executive General Secretary of the U.S. Bishop Conference, made a telephone call to the provincial of St. Louis, Sister Rockledge, to inquire would she accept the role of Administrator General if Theresa was to be removed from office. And Rock said, absolutely not, and then immediately called Theresa to let her know that this request was going on. So in the meantime, then, in her capacity as president of the LCWR, Theresa had to journey to Rome, and she decided to try to have a meeting with Cardinal Peronio, who's the director of the Sacred Congregation of Religious, the Vatican office responsible for dealing with religious orders, to try to defuse the situation. And she remembers the night before the meeting, she had a hard time sleeping. She prayed her favorite prayer, the Magnificat, and had what she calls a very spiritual experience. She says, as if God was somehow overshadowing me. There is that part in the gospel that says Mary was overshadowed by the Holy Spirit, and I had a sense of a cloud going over me, and somehow a message came, I am with you, and I will be with you tomorrow. She says, I felt very keenly that night that the Holy Spirit was, in a sense, being with me. So she was peaceful, slept soundly, went in the next day. As she's waiting in the antechamber of Cardinal Peronio's office, she overhears a conversation with two American bishops. The walls were very thin in this office, and the door was ajar. She easily identified Bishop Kelly, but didn't know who the other one was. But she heard Peronio asking the bishops, what's happening with the Theresa Cain case? And Kelly's reply came clear. Well, we're working on it now. We're talking about working towards some resolution of it. A profoundly shocked Theresa remembers thinking, oh my God, here I am hoping to diffuse the situation, and they're talking about putting me out. When she was ushered in, Theresa first told Peronio of her concerns about the heightened tensions over the mercy experience with tubal ligations in church policy. And then, I think has got to be courageous, she confronted him about what she had overheard and asked for an explanation. He said, I'm very sorry that happened. That's not supposed to happen. These doors are supposed to be closed tight. But Theresa says he really wasn't sorry about it. He was just sorry it was discovered. And then Cardinal told him that the Vatican had serious concerns about her and the TL study, even mentioning that the Pope had talked to him twice about Sister Theresa's behavior. So in December 12th, after she writes a letter to with two of sisters, A Conversation with God, which was published in the Mercy newsletter, Union Scope. And I just want to quote from part of it because it gives you an idea of what was happening within her while she's facing all these tensions with her and her team. She says, I ask especially my God for courage for myself and for others to be willing to confront and critique unjust structures and systems. I hope be they political, social, religious, or ecclesiastic. I hope we'll receive the grace to realize that we must address internal disarmament issues in our church, especially the issues of violence expressed in sexism, domination, and the abuse of power. As a church, we will not be a credible force for the 21st century if we do not appropriate the human rights agenda in our own structures. She persisted. Okay, and finally, I want to talk just briefly about what I call coming to maturity in a patriarchal church that applies to all of us, I think. So even though it was an extremely stressful time, Theresa never remembers feeling alone or isolated in her exercise of leadership. She says, I always felt so supported. I had a very strong team that worked very closely together, so I never felt I was alone in any of it, not at all. Yet, because of the institutional pressures they were dealing with, Theresa and her team did begin consulting with a sister of mercy who was a mental health professional, a clinical psychologist. And she met with them individually and together and made recommendations about who might benefit from further counseling. She did suggest that Theresa receive further counseling. And so over a period of 2 years, she journeyed every other month from Washington, D.C. to Albany, New York, to meet with a male psychologist who also, I believe, happened to be Jewish, not a Catholic. And Theresa recalls, he told me this is like going through a divorce, she remembers. The psychologist suggested that her relationship with the institutional church was changing, quote, from being a child in the church to a woman in the church with your own authority, close quote. Remembering the experience today, Theresa reflects, quote, I think it purified my relationship with the hierarchy and with authority, and maybe particularly with men who were in ecclesial authority. We grew up in a setting where, even though theoretically we all knew we were equal, at the same time we had that inhibition towards authority and towards men who were bishops. And I think that I, in a sense, moved out of that, where I became free of those constraints, and I felt strong and equal to them. For me, I was fascinated that Theresa chose the word purification or purifying to describe her changed relationship. I asked her about it, and this is what she said. Purity is a word that means a great deal to me in terms of my spiritual life. You know, we talk about sin and about offending God, and for me, it is like the interior spirit is trying to have a purification. It is like my inner spirit with God. The term we used to use was to be chaste. I want myself to be as pure as I can be. So anything that is not of God, I want to have it cleared from my consciousness, from my spirit, from my life. End of quote. So to sum up, for Theresa, subordination of women is not of God. And so cleansing her interior spirit of an unconscious tendency to defer to male authority solely because of its maleness was both purifying and liberating. And in my view, this purification may be one source of Theresa's remarkable ability to persevere in the face of so many obstacles, both within and without. And that's it. And I think it went long. I'm sorry, but there was so much good material I couldn't resist.
Thanks so much, Chris. So we're going to have Theresa talk for a little bit now. Great.
I want first to say to welcome everyone who has come and joined with us this evening. It's delightful, and it's certainly even very informative to me to review some of the life experiences again. And truly, I do hope that it was worthwhile for everyone. And I want to thank Chris. We have certainly bonded beautifully before that, but throughout the whole creation of the biography. And to thank Debbie and Russ. They are the focus of the future church and have been really very available and have done a wonderful service to all of us. by being here last week and again tonight and next week. Actually, I wanted to just maybe make one or two reflections, and it had to do with the change in our own attitudes towards authority. When I entered the convent, I did not experience that the authorities in the religious order were dictatorial, at least not overtly, they were not, but I did experience an authoritarianism. And I think that was not only true of the church, but true of the times and certainly true of the church itself. And I think after the experience and grace of the renewal within the church with Vatican Council II, the qualities of collegiality became very central to us. So we were not, in a sense, dealing with superiors. We were dealing with other members in our community who had been called to leadership service, but they were truly friends. They were our colleagues. They were our equals. And that made a wonderful, very dramatic change in the structures of religious life. I think collegiality was very central. I do think dialogue became very sacred to us, that it was not a matter of just getting orders. I think in some ways, even the title I had when I went to Washington was, well, right before that, I will say, was Superior General. So we combined both the authoritarianism of a segment with the military segment. And we were somewhat a combination of that. And I think that through God's grace and through our own perseverance, moving into dialogue, moving into collegiality, these were very sacred moments to us. And I think the one that maybe is most important that I want to just mention tonight is that of subsidiarity. And that was very powerful. And what we said was the decision was to be made at the level where the authority was, which meant that each sister in conscience was to make the decisions that were appropriate for her life. And so for me, subsidiarity is probably core to the changes that we have experienced. I think another area that I want to mention, and Chris did really speak about it, is when Sister Agnes Mary was removed as a Sister of Mercy, she was really treated very poorly. And in some ways, the bishops who were handling her case saw her more as a cleric than as a woman in a religious community. And they dealt with her as they would deal with one of their own clerics, that the decision was made and she was to accept the decision and she had to sign that she would abide by that decision. That was totally against her conscience. She could not do it. As leaders at the time, we in turn did seek legal advice, both canonical and civil. And we were advised that the apostolic signature is equal to the Supreme Court. It is the highest court for the Catholic Church. So we made a decision, not lightly. It was done with a prayer, but also with a determination that this was a decision that was very, very wrong, and in some ways was so wrong that it was evil, that we wanted to make an appeal of that decision. So we proceeded to the apostolic signature and prepared all of the documents. And in the end, what happened is that we were told that we were actually bringing canonical suit against the Pope. And that is not possible in the Catholic Church. So the letter that came back to us said that the highest authority in the church is the Pope, and that it is not at all possible for anyone to bring legal suit, canonical suit against the Pope. So that was really a very short letter, very terse. That was really the end of as much as we could do at that time in regard to Sister Agnes Mary. Sister Agnes Mary continued as an associate member of the Sisters of Mercy. She was extraordinarily generous with any of the resources that she had. When she became ill, she was invited to the infirmary for the Sisters of Mercy in Detroit, where she died, and she's buried with the Sisters of Mercy. So those were very painful, but also very beautiful conclusion of a life of a woman who truly was compassionate and passionate, and very attuned to want to be in service with the women and children who are economically poor. Those are probably two areas I wanted to mention. And Chris and I, of course, are most willing to take any comments you may have, any questions, any critique you may have of what you have heard or what you know, and in any way that you would like some response from us. I think Debbie maybe will be organizing this.
Yeah, I will do that. So I just want to sort of repeat how we ask questions. So if you want to ask a question, we ask you to unmute yourself, but it's very important. Unmute yourself, but don't ask the question until I call on you. It comes up in the order that you unmute yourself. And so I will see that you have a question, and I will call on you to go ahead and ask your question, but don't do it until I've actually called on you. I just want to, I want to start while people are unmuting. So if you do unmute, you'll have to have a quiet background, or else we're going to hear everything. So I don't know, somebody's making a lot of noise in the background, so we're going to have to ask that. But first of all, I just want to tell Chris, thank you for such a beautiful rendition of those chapters. It is just, you are such a phenomenal teacher. It's just wonderful to hear it. And Theresa, I can't tell you what it's like to sit here and listen to you talk about those years, and to know, I often think about what it would be like to go through the kinds of strains and pains, sorrow and suffering that you've gone through. I know you're strong, but then there's these, that it's so hard to hear, much less I can't even imagine living it. So I'm always curious about, how do people get through it and how you get through it with that, with the kind of spirit you have. So you're just a living monument to what we can be as human beings, because you certainly have seen suffering and probably suffered more to watch your sisters in arms, the sisters around you suffer. So the story is so good. So I'm gonna let other people ask a question. Yeah.
I want to acknowledge that Sister Helen Marie Burns is on the call, and she was Agnes Mary's provincial, and she was also on the tubal ligation thing. And I did text her to see if she wanted to say anything, and she said, well, she'd play it by ear. But I thought we might give her the opportunity, if she wishes to comment, before we open the questions. I don't know.
Sister Helen, go ahead. Go ahead, Sister Helen.
Yes, thank you. No, I mean, wonderfully done. Congratulations, Theresa and Christine, on the recognition of the book. The one thing I always like to say relative to Agnes Mary, and that was my primary involvement, but also I sat with the meetings through the tubal ligations. I could answer a few questions there if anyone has any, but The one thing that I felt most painful and most egregious was that no one from the official church in the course of that time with Agnes Mary ever asked me about the quality of her religious life, the quality of her religious commitment, which was very sound, deep, and exemplary. That didn't seem to be important, and I felt it was probably at the heart and most essential. So thank you very much. I'll go on to mute.
Thank you, Helen. Beautiful
Thanks,
to
Helen.
see you.
Wow. Okay, so I'm going to call on Dot Malone to ask your question.
I don't have any. I thought I muted myself.
Okay, that's fine. No problem. So we'll go to Julie McGree.
Yes, hi. My mouth dropped open when I was reading about the betrayal of the sisters by the bishops, the betrayal of the sisters by the Vatican, the vindictiveness, the evil of the way Sister Agnes Mary was treated. And my question is, what kept you in the church? What kept you as a vowed religious, devoting one's life to the church? And what would you advise a young woman who's considering religious life, but is hesitating to be part of the official patriarchal, corrupt church?
For Chris.
Well, I think that it's the same thing. You can't change the structure from outside it, so that's sort of a head thing. I really want to talk about the heart thing, though, first of all, because I think a call to vowed religious life is of a piece with our baptism, but it's also a very specific sort of spiritual journey that for an individual best expresses who they are in themselves and who they are in God. And that's the primary thing, so as long as that relationship is solid and whatever discernment one is doing about ministerial involvements that, goes along with your community, not just your religious community, but your faith community and your parishes, in many ways that grows from the relationship that one has with God. And so just those ministerial involvements involve risk, but God is faithful. So you have what you need to take those risks, and it comes from a place of love and commitment, and that's very fulfilling, even if the rest of it is just crap, So I think this is what I tried to do in the book. No one can do any of these things that Theresa has done or that anyone else has done without a firmly rooted relationship with God. That's where your strength comes from. That's where your consolation comes from. That's where your correction comes from sometimes when you're tempted to really hate the people that are doing stuff to you. It's just a bigger reality than the sinful structures. It's just like Monica said, there are structures of sin, but there are structures of grace too. And I think people who are called to systemic change, it's a sacred call. And you have the strength to persevere because God cares about the change even more than you do. And God will sustain and support you in that.
Thank you, Chris. That was beautiful. And to the woman who just spoke, my parents were immigrants, and they migrated from Ireland as young people, and they were poor people also. And we grew up in a neighborhood that was mixed in terms of religion, certainly not mixed in terms of race, but religion. And many of the neighbors were economically poor. They were Irish immigrants. And I sometimes would say when I'm asked about being a Catholic, I wasn't baptized a Catholic, I was born a Catholic. My very beginnings, it was just a total part of my life. But I think the question of why one continues, I think what I found very helpful was the fact that the Sisters of Mercy, we were able to move into a very respectful dialogic atmosphere of communication. Great discourse and much diversity within the discourse. Whether it was positive or negative, it still had value to us. And I think all of that then somehow outweighed some of the difficult things that were going on in my leadership with the hierarchy of the church. And I do remember a bishop in New York who had retired but was a very wise man. He said to me, do not be concerned about the meeting you're going to. Do not be concerned about what you will say or what you will do. And his final words I've never forgotten, and not only his, but many others. The Holy Spirit will be with you. And you need to trust that God will tell you what to do and what to say. And I often reflect back on that. And I think one of my great warnings is that you need to be true to oneself. And what has helped me very much is to not only be a rational being, but a deeply feeling being. And when I'm feeling uncomfortable, that I need to make that known, or at least recognize it in myself. So the sense of authority within oneself is a very powerful belief in my life. I agree feel in terms of Catholicity and remaining within the church and knowing that the church, what we have done in these last years, in the years of renewal, we actually converted it from an institution, even though the structures are still there, to community. So for us, whatever that we are doing as a Catholic has to do with my being in a community and not necessarily institution. And I still believe that the institution has structures which are actually not of God and need to not only be changed, but need to be eradicated.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you, Theresa. So Dan McFadden, would you like to ask your question?
Hello, Theresa. What a wonderful testament of sanctity and heroism as I've listened to the story tonight. My question is, oh, by the way, my parents are both from Donegal, so I can relate to your historical background. But my question is this an American-only movement? And where is the rest of the world?
He asked, it's an American-only movement. Whoops.
I believe that it certainly is a universal movement. Yes. And I think we found that particularly when we began to bond beyond our own country. And several of us can speak tonight to having been part of international conferences where we had the women and men from South and Central America had a conference with the Canadian community, with the United States community. And then we've also had the gift of what we refer to as the International Union of Generals, which is based in Rome. And there's a meeting there every 3 years where there are primarily women from around the world who are at these conferences. And I would have to say, in my experience, overwhelmingly, we were very much in accord with each other, maybe moving at different levels or at different speeds. But for instance, at least the issue that I will mention is that of women, because it is become a very serious and a provocative agenda for the 21st century, and rightfully so, belongs there. But I would listen to many women from different countries in Africa, Asia, South America, and they too were very concerned about it. Unfortunately, some of them were diocesan communities. They were new, fairly new, they were young, and they were very much under the control of who their diocesan bishop was. And when they would leave the meetings, they went with a resolution. That was a change they had to make. And that's one experience I can give you on that.
You know, I'd like to just chime in here a bit, because during my time with Future Church, we did meet internationally, International Movement for We Are Church and others, but it's grown exponentially in terms of the church renewal reform movement, and lots of good stuff happening that Deb is much more qualified to speak to than I am. But I'm amazed at how the grassroots efforts in Europe and all.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you,
Let's
Jan.
move. Can I move on to Marion Bowden has been waiting. Marion, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, yes. First of all, tonight is an evening I'm most proud of being a Mercy Associate. I feel wonderful about the history that I've heard tonight. But my question is personal, and I hope it applies to other women. There are times I just want to go out on strike. I don't want to give any of my time, any of my talent, any of my treasure, any of anything. I just want to, like, I don't know, go in the corner. And then there are other times they say, kind of like what Richard Ross says, if you don't, you can be on the margins, but you have to be on the inside to be taken seriously. So I don't leave, and I do try to do what I do. So what's your advice? I feel so torn. I just don't know what to do.
Well, Marion, I would say when you feel that deeply about it, go. But that doesn't mean that you go and you don't continue to be integrated with those whom you love and whom you respect and who are your friends. I think we need to strengthen that relationship all the time. So even your sharing with us tonight, I believe is very helpful, not only for you, but for us. There are times when we need to retreat. And of course, we can go through lives where we don't have any retreat. And we need retreat. We also need to engage and re-engage. But there may be times our spirit is telling us to move away. I also think personally for myself, I have found it very helpful to have someone with whom I may confide and be perfectly honest and truthful and confide in another who then has really been, in my experience sometimes, that person has been the Holy Spirit to me. And I try to listen carefully and to receive some sense of peace amidst whatever my distress would be.
Beautiful. We have Signature, Signatur. I'm not sure what the name is, but that's how it's showing up. Would you like to ask your question?
No, I don't have a question. I'm sorry. I thought I was on mute.
Okay, so yeah, it's a little bit confusing. So, but yeah, okay, thank you. Let's go with
respond. The Supreme Court of the Catholic Church is referred to as the Apostolic Signature. It is set up very much like similar to the Supreme Court of the United States, with the exception that I believe the president can be appealed, the president of the United States, but the Pope cannot be appealed.
Yeah. So let's go to, I think it's Walia, Walia. Do you have a question?
Yeah, that's good. Okay, let me put that video on. I don't know if you all want to address this tonight because it's kind of off topic, but I remember Chris talking at a call to action meeting and saying that for her interest, she wanted to support women becoming deacons within the church. She did not at that point, want to support Roman Catholic women priests. And I'm just wondering if that position has changed. Either one of you, both of you, I'd like to hear on this topic. And also, if you are in agreement that women should be priests, is there any reaching out to the community of Roman Catholic women priests that you're trying to bridge, because there's more power the more people are involved? So that's my question.
Well, I will give you one simple response, and then I would ask Chris to continue it. I was speaking in a large audience one day, and someone did get up at the end to ask questions, and I could sense from the person that the question was somewhat hostile. And the person said to me, "Do you really want to be a Catholic priest?" And you could hear the impatience in the voice. And I said, "Well, since you are asking me about that, if I had the opportunity, based on the readership and based on my experience, I think I might be more inclined to consider the bishopric rather than being the clergy." So actually, and I've gone on to say, and this will help a little bit, is that women as well as men are called to be popes, to be cardinals, to be bishops, to be priests, to be deacons, to be faithful members of the Catholic community. So I don't have any exclusion on any of the ministries. I'll turn it to Chris now.
God love her.
And while I want to say that I'm not sure where you heard me speak, but I do want to be clear that my response was, in my own mind, because this is what I often said, was stating sort of where Future Church is on the spectrum of reform, okay, in the church. And in terms of women's ordination to the priesthood, we, at that time, had always talked about ongoing discussion and sort of the primacy of conscience and ongoing discussion of the importance of women being included in all the ministries of the church. A lot of the organization, and I'm talking about 10 years ago now, was being put into women deacons because that seemed like the doable next step. With regard to Roman Catholic women priests, I have some very dear friends that have been ordained as Roman Catholic women priests. I have helped some of those women in their discernment or at their request that came and talked to me. I do not, but from the point of view of Future Church, that's not where the organization was putting its energies. So I have great respect for Roman Catholic women priests because they have willingly accepted the penalty of excommunication, but are staying within the church to help change and bring about the reforms that need to happen. So I do think that we have to understand, in terms of how movements work, everybody works at it at a different place, okay? And so what I think my response was at the time is naming what the place was Future Church was working in the spectrum of reform. So I hope that helps.
Great. Thank you very much. We have tremendous respect for Roman Catholic women priests. They are pioneers in every single way. So I want to go to Kathleen. I don't know how to say your last name, Penosi. Yeah. I think you've been waiting a little bit. So you want to ask your question?
Thank you. I was a Sister of Mercy for 15 years, and much of this story is part of my history too. My situation right now is that with a number of other women, we have formed an intentional Eucharistic community called the Magdalena Community of Hope. And I still participate in my local parish, but I must say that I really understand the frustration of people who say that the church is not relevant, especially if you look at the number or the age of the people on this call. Not a lot of younger women or men. So for Theresa, I'm really glad to hear of your courage and your willingness to stay in this community, to make it more of a community. And I think that's what many intentional Eucharistic communities are at this moment. So it's more common. My question, which is a little fresh, is was there any restriction on the vasectomies of men when there was a problem with tubal ligations for women?
Kathleen, thank you. I think I have the right name. Kathleen, thank you. First, I want to respond maybe to what we were saying about the communities today. I mean, there is an outpouring of Eucharistic communities throughout the United States, and I believe in any number of parts of the world, where women and men come together. I know a group in New York City, once a month, they go either a Saturday evening or a Sunday evening, and they spend 2 to 3 hours together. That is their Eucharist. They're not in an established church. They're not officially with a parish. However, they are certainly very much a part of a Eucharistic community, and they're very much at peace with that. That is their community, that is their church. And they have no hesitation about continuing that and strengthening it. So for me, that's an example of asserting one's own authority and initiating a new community that will be really grace-filled and very, very helpful to you personally. Now, that does not mean that they do not enter into maybe family or community gatherings, or certainly baptisms or weddings or funerals, but their primary community is that community that they meet with one evening a month. And for them, that's church. And that has happened quite a number of places, and it's becoming much better known. I think in terms of the vasectomy for the men, I know that was never part of our conversation, and I'm not sure that it ever even got mentioned, or that even we as a group of women meeting with the bishops actually raised that question. We raised many others, but that one we didn't raise, so now you've given me a new one.
That's great. Thanks.
Thank you, Catherine.
Yeah.
I
So,
would just add here, there are many small faith communities that are meeting, and many of them have both a small faith community and a loyalty to their parish.
Yeah.
There are many parishes that are very active in social justice and issues like that. So I think, Future Church got founded by parishes. So it's not monolithic. There are some very vital, vibrant local parishes that I think do a good job doing pastoral outreach. So it's not sort of an either or.
Yeah,
great. So Joanne, I see you have your hand raised.
Hi, my name is Joanne Di Quattro. I'm a sister of the Holy Names of Jesus and Mary. I live in California. And Theresa, you have been one of my sheroes.
Thank you.
On October 7th, 1979, I was preparing my lesson plan for the coming week for my 7th grade students when I heard you speak to the Pope on behalf of women. To this day, I get goosebumps when I think of your words. Subsequently, I was able to have a retreat with you, our retreat center in Santa Cruz. But one of the most profound experiences I had in relation to your stance was with Sister Agnes Mary Mansour. when I was a staff member at the Peace and Justice Center, Southern California. And our staff, including Anita Casperry and Susan Maloney, went to the parish of the vicar for religious in our diocese. I have been to many, many witnesses on behalf of many issues. This was the first and only time I was ever spit upon.
Oh,
And Theresa, I thank you for your witness. I'm most appreciative of you and the Sisters of Mercy for everything you went through. I loved Chris's book, and I thank you for your place in our lives.
Thank you very much, Joanne, and it certainly is an honor to see you again and to hear your words, and I deeply revere them and will remember them. So I thank you. And Sister Anita Casperry was also one of my heroes, women heroes, and still is very much alive in spirit today.
great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Theresa. I
Yeah.
love you.
Thank you.
We're only going to take one more question. We're already past 9:30, so we could talk forever, like till midnight. I'm sure we would never want to let you go. But I think Kay Furlani, if you would like to ask your question, then we're going to have to cut it off, unfortunately.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Theresa, just thinking of your words about the change from a child to a woman, realizing your own authority, and the time that you're talking about in the 70s, because I'm only a few years younger than you are. And not being a religious sister, but I think generally for many, many women around the world in that period of time, there was an awakening of moving from being a child who would be subjected to the authority of anybody, a parent, a husband, a pastor or a pope, to beginning to claim, our own authority as people ourselves. And then I was, as I was thinking about the word authority, I was thinking about Jesus. And it just seems to me, and I wonder if you could say something to this, that Jesus had a sense of his own authority, so that what other people said or did, about him didn't deter him from what he was about and what he was called to do. And I think that you exemplify that call to be who you are and what you're about. And I think that, we're all called to that. Could you say something to that?
Okay, well, I think my reflection is that I am the author of my own life. And God has created me. And in that creation, I have been, it is not given to me from outside. But very often, I think what we do without realizing it is that authority and power are certainly very much one. And we don't realize that that's what we're doing. So we can very often give power to someone else, whether that's good or whether it's bad. It has, but that I need to, in a sense, assert my own authority, be aware of the limit, and a tremendous difficulty where I need to make a decision. The decision may be against the official authority of either church or society. Be at peace, being called make someone else's decision. I am called to be co-responsible with others in our work as we continue our journey. But I think the authority of each one is central. And I think as women, we really didn't develop it or deepen it because we patriarch, the overwhelming system that we have in church and in society, both. But we also have hierarchy. We also had, as women, we were basically, and we were passive. And it, in a sense, I just this week was reading an article, and it's very much something I've said in the past, that even now in the wedding ceremony, we still have the long tradition of the father escorting his daughter. And that father gives away that daughter to a man because for not only centuries, but for many societies, the woman was property. And in parts of our world today, the woman is still considered property. So she can be given away. And we even have still strong culture of name change that goes on for the woman, but certainly not for the man. So there are so many examples that we can use in terms of why we were not able to assert and to develop our own sense of authority, which comes with it serious responsibility for one's thinking, for one's acting, and for one's decisions. I hope that's a little helpful to you.
Thank you so much.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Theresa. So I want to, first of all, wrap this up and say thank you to Theresa. I feel like I'm listening to a great sage, and with Chris as well. You are so it's so wonderful to hear your words. They feel so wise. I'm going to turn it over to Russ, who's going to give us a few announcements and a final prayer, and then we're going to say goodnight to each other.
Thank you very much, both of you and everyone.
Thank you. So just a couple of announcements. This upcoming Sunday is Pentecost Sunday. So we're having a special prayer service, Fire of Justice, and that is co-hosted with Benincasa Community in New York City, Call to Action, Catholics for Choice, Corpus, Dignity USA, Roman Catholic Women Priests, the Quixote Center, Southeastern Pennsylvania Women's Ordination Conference, Water, Women's Ordination Conference, and Future Church. So we're really pleased that we're all coming together to lift up the voices of immigrants and to call on Cardinal Dolan, among others, U.S. Catholic Church, to stand with the most vulnerable among us and not with the most powerful. So you can go to www.futurechurch.org/fire-of-justice. I'll throw that in the chat so that you can have that. And also we have an update to our Women Erase series on June 18th at 8 p.m. Professor Carol Dempsey, who is a Dominican sister, is going to present on reading the Bible against the grain. And that's sort of about the new interpretations, or the new interpretation theories and skills that we have at our disposal to understand the context that the scriptures were written in. So those two things, I've put them in the chat. You can check out those links later on. Our closing prayer tonight comes from this wonderful book, More Than Words, Prayers for Inclusive Communities.
That's our sister Pat Kozak. I'm going to claim her.
Yes, Sister Pat Kozak and Janet Shaffron.
Janet Shaffron. Yeah.
Loving Creator, we ask for wholeness for ourselves and for our church. Do not fear, ignorance, or pride to limit the action of your Spirit. nor allow mere custom to prevent the divine creativity within us from bearing fruit. We ask for the insight to understand the needs of people today, that we might grasp the complexity of the situations that we face and the absolute simplicity of human need. The poor have a right to hear the gospel, the hungry a right to food, the oppressed a right to freedom. Enable all of us to be women and men enthusiastic for your ministry, contagious in our love, and eager to be among your people as ones who serve. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much. Thank you.